Yeah. Spend more time.
It seems like maybe we're gonna need to stay here. I don't, the camera doesn't follow us, does it?
No.
Okay.
Direct
We're presenting. with these right here.
Do you want me to move it over to where you can stand up front?
I don't know, what do you think is best positioning?
Well, I was thinking in terms of the people who are going to do.
Yeah, so they need to be able to see us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the person I prefer to stand when I talk.
Yeah.
I give them a side with the screen.
It's like pointing here.
Or, you know, I think you could be on one side. I don't know.
Yeah. How wide that angle that we can't.
Yeah. If you're the last to arrive, you have to sit right in the front row. Is the camera going to be able to see both of us as well as the screen? Or is it better if we both stand on the same side of the screen?
Here, see both things.
But also people online, it's screen shared, so they have the PowerPoint shared.
Okay.
So they'll be able to see you, but also.
Okay. Is it sharing just the screen or is it sharing the PowerPoint right now?
It's sharing the screen and the PowerPoint. So the PowerPoint's up, so you were gonna click through the document, so when you do that, it'll show that as well. So that should be good, and the camera's pointed right.
Okay.
So, okay, I want to. And you'll have the clicker, correct?
I think we still have it right there.
Go. This is for y'all, it should already be connected. Whoever's going first. Yes, I love your work. I still love your work. I'm saying you're my friends. So it's really exciting. Wow.
This has become All right, welcome everybody. This is workshop number 1, as you can see here, designing RAD WAC research. My name is Michael Pemberton. I'm a professor at Georgia Southern University.
And I'm Chris Baskier. I'm director of university writing at Auburn University.
Even though we have 3 hours for this workshop, I think that we're going to find that time goes pretty quickly and we have a lot of things to do, a lot of things to talk about. So in relatively small workshops, you would go around the room and have everybody introduce themselves. But since this is also a hybrid presentation, I think we're going to pass on that for now. You will have some opportunities to work in small groups and get to know one another a little bit later in the workshop. But for now, I will turn it over to Chris to ask the first question.
Yeah, actually, before we jump into that, I wanted to give people some time to access our Google Drive folder where we have the materials for the workshop. I know this is dark, so I'll read it out loud. If you just go to aub.ie/RADWAC RAD WAC. And this should be set so anybody with the link can access it. I do have a few hard copies here, so as we're going through things, if you need a hard copy for accessibility reasons or because your laptop dies or whatever, just raise your hand. I have, I think, about 10 copies. And I think those of you who are online, you should be getting that link in the chat as well. All right, so we'll get into this in depth in a moment, but when we're talking about RAD, we're talking about replicable, aggregable, and data supported research. And so we wanted, just by show of hands, to get a feel for the level of familiarity with a RAD research methodology or mindset. So if you are pretty intimately familiar with RAD research, you feel like you have a pretty good sense of what it is, if you could raise your hand. Okay, a couple. If you're sort of kind of familiar, you maybe have heard of it, but you haven't spent a lot of time working in it.
Could you step just a little?
Yeah. Raise your hand if maybe you have like a moderate amount. Okay. And if you're pretty new to it, you're not familiar, you haven't encountered the acronym before. All right, cool. So we have a mixture, and that's a good thing, right? So those of you who do have more experience, we do hope that you'll contribute and offer your perspectives. And those of you who are new to it, we're hoping that you'll have good critical questions to ask that'll help enrich everybody's understanding of RAD research as well.
Okay, so this is kind of a quick overview of what we're going to be doing during the workshop today. As you can see, we have essentially divided up into 4 parts. The first part, we're going to be talking about RAD principles with some examples that are drawn from some of the research that I've done and that Chris has done in our sort of individual research agendas. Part 2, what we're going to be doing is looking at some précis or summaries or abstracts of actual RAD WAC research articles that have been published. You'll see when you take a look at them that obviously, since they are précis, we're not asking you to read the whole 25-page to 30-page article, but you can kind of get a sense of what the article is about and how these articles are structured. The third part, we're going to be giving you some data. And we're going to ask you to take a look at this as a sort of institutional context and to think about what are some of the research questions that you might address in this context, and how would you go about actually structuring a study, as well as what sorts of data would you have to collect in addition to what you're provided in order to do the study that you want to do to answer your research question. And then we'll talk about that in small groups as well. Part 4, we're going to take the big leap, which is taking everything that you've learned, everything that you've talked about, everything that you've done, and trying to think about how you would design and devise a RAD research study at your campus, in your institution, in your context. Okay, how can you actually make it work? So do some kind of preliminary brainstorming in that regard.
Before we jump into this, was everybody able to access the Google Drive folder?
No.
No? Okay.
It's just spinning.
It's just spinning. Is it because of your internet?
No, is it auv.ie/RAD WAC? Yeah, it's just.
Okay. Try it. See if you can access other websites, because it may be a Wi-Fi issue. We had some troubles with Wi-Fi earlier, and we do have a tech person for support in the room who can help you as well. Yeah. When I can pass things out per table too when we're you won't need anything right this moment.
No, I got on my phone. What's the best way to get on this slide?
There's it's called Clemson Guest.
Yes.
Yeah, you might need to close your browser down and then open it up again, and then try to join.
Should I just?
What I've had to do.
Yeah. We've also found it easier on PCs than on Macs.
Yes.
You have no problem. Okay. That's my PC prejudice coming out.
Okay, so let's go ahead and keep moving along. So I just spelled out the acronym a minute ago for RAD or RAD research. R is standing for replicable. So this is the idea that there's sufficient detail about all the elements of the study, from the methods to the participants, to the context, to the research questions, etc., so that other researchers could repeat the study. Now, we are cognizant that there's no such thing as exact replication, exact repetition, because the contexts in which we are often engaged in this kind of study are variable, right? They can't all the elements and all of the variables can't necessarily be controlled, but you can try to be as transparent about those principles to such an extent that others can do them as well. Those differences in context or in approach are actually part of what leads to aggregability. So aggregation is the idea that our knowledge about whatever the phenomenon under investigation is, writing broadly, right, but different elements of that, accrues over time based on the replication and addition of studies and maybe addition of new methods, et cetera. And so sometimes those contextual differences can say, yes, this applied in this context. When we tried to do it over here, it was a little different. Here's how it was different. Here's how that enriches our knowledge of what it is that we're studying. And then when we're thinking about data supported, we're defining data fairly capaciously. This could be quantitative, this could be qualitative, this could be textual. But the idea is that the data, whatever the data is, it can be readily identified by the readers and that you know where it came from. Did it come from interviews? Did it come from archival research? Did it come from survey-driven research?
So the framework that we're going to be using to talk about RAD research is actually a framework that we are borrowing from some work that was done by Driscoll and Purdue in 2012, identifying what are some of the common RAD research elements. And you can think about this in a variety of ways, not only in terms of how you might design a RAD study, but about how the data and information and the results of that study would be presented in a publication. You'll often find, as it's mentioned down here, that this is in some ways analogous to what's called the IMRAD framework. Are you familiar with that? The introduction, the methodology, the results, the analysis, and the discussion. And you'll find that in a number of articles in a variety of different fields that are using these kinds of methodologies, they will present the data and the information in that relatively structured way. So according to Driscoll and Purdue, these are the typical components of most RAD research studies. The first of which is to identify the background and significance of the study. So you can already see that that's something that's going to be placing it within a context of previous studies, previous research, as well as a discussion of how and why this is important or exigent. And I should also say that I'm going to give kind of a quick overview of this, but then we will also go into some detail about what is in each of these areas and what are these various components and a little bit with a little bit more thoroughness. So background and significance, identifying elements and describing the study design, how the data was collected, and also this is something that we are adding because we think it's a really important point to emphasize here. For those of you who are considering doing studies, especially using human subjects, the IRB becomes a very important aspect of your lives. That's the Institutional Research Board, because they have to review and approve of everything that you do in the study that involves people. So selection of participants or texts. How did you describe, how did you determine what people or what text to study? What's the method of analysis that you're using? The presentation of the results, and it's important also to make a distinction here that results are not the same thing as analysis. The results are literally the raw data that you are presenting to show what it is that your investigation has found. Then there's a discussion of what this data means as well as implications. And typically you'll find at the end of most of these articles that are written about RAD research, they talk about the limitations of the research and how does this perhaps point to future work that can be done in order to address some of the current limitations.
So to get into a little bit more detail here, that first component is background and significance. So here we're really thinking about how the study is situated in the prior literature and how you are accounting for the prior literature in such a way that you recognize the knowledge that exists. And then you're maybe either identifying gaps or opportunities, depending on how you're going to frame that. Timeliness also comes into play here. This doesn't mean that we never cite things from 40 or 50 years ago, because there can still be a lot of value in that. But there is the recognition that there is an ongoing body of research and conversation, and that we want to account for new and emerging perspectives and work to build on those as well.
The second part has to do with study design, data collection, and again, the Institutional Research Board. The IRB is perhaps going to be less important if you're doing specifically something like archival research, or you're not working with people in any sense to collect your data. But in this section, you have to make sure that the methods that you use are detailed enough so that the study could be reliably replicated in a new context. Method section describes data collection, gives justification for the methodological choices and how those choices relate to the study objectives, and identifies and describes research questions or hypotheses. Researchers make methodological choices that do not introduce bias into data collection, analysis, and description of results, and or make justifiable attempts to address and control for bias. And I'll sort of supplement this with one anecdote from my experience as an editor of a research journal, which is sometimes we would find people who were using ostensibly RAD methodologies in order to collect data from students and from artifacts and texts and other things. And then they would say, our research team got together and we looked at all of this data and we determined that this is what it shows. Okay, so there's actually no presentation of the methodology that they use. There's no presentation of how they determined what the criteria were that they were going to use to assess and identify particular features of the data that they collected. So, you know, oftentimes these are the sorts of articles that have to be rejected because they are not actually giving you information that's essential in order for you to be able to understand whether or not the conclusions that are being drawn are in fact supported by the data. Okay.
So then there's the selection of participants and or text. So here we're thinking about how you are actually justifying the sources of the data that you're going to be bringing out and the people that you're going to be engaging with. If you, in some cases, you may get very technical here, especially for survey-based research. So you may have, for example, a very large survey response rate if you're luckier than me. And then you need to think about how are you actually going to be doing sampling of that data and what kind of sample structures are you using in order to have a simple random selection, et cetera, so that it's valid and reliable and can be repeated. Or for case studies, interviews, for observational type research, who are the participants? Why are you looking at them? What are their backgrounds, identities, demographics, their professions, and how does that tap into the research questions that you have and the methodological paradigm that you're going to be using? For textual analysis, a similar thing. What's the selection process? How did you go about identifying the texts and building your corpus or your archive that you're then engaging in your analysis of?
So next section, the method of analysis. Obviously, you know that there are innumerable ways that you can take a data set and apply a framework to it in order to perform some sort of analysis. Sometimes that's going to be determined by the research question that you have and what it is that you're going to be looking for. Sometimes it may be because you want to, you've identified a methodological framework that you think would be relevant or important or useful to apply to this data set that perhaps hasn't been done before. But you have to make sure that whatever it is that you decide to do and however you decide to go about it, when you're describing it, you have to do so in detail and explain how you analyzed it. So with the previous example that I gave you with somebody who's writing about a research study and saying the team looked at it and we decided that these were the interesting criteria and this is what we found. Again, with the idea of aggregability and something that's data supported, you have to make sure that you're pretty clear about that. That the methodology you choose fits the research question and your research design, and it's meaningful. So that means, at least in part, you identify the categories of analysis and operational definitions and describe them, and then the researchers provide concrete evidence that the analysis was done in a systematic manner. Okay.
So then we have the presentation of results. So they are presented, as it says here, in a clear and accessible manner. Maybe there are appropriate graphics if you're doing any kind of quantitative analysis or even presenting the qualitative work, say maybe in a table format, or excerpts from texts or interviews are set off in such a way that they're clearly identifiable as such. And they're presented in a way that separates the presentation of results from the discussion or analysis of those results. And that's something that I know I continue to struggle with, but especially struggled with as I was first learning to do this kind of analysis, because I was taught you present a piece of evidence and then you immediately analyze what it means. But the idea here is to kind of separate those things a little bit, so that gives the reader the opportunity to examine the results for themselves before then getting the researcher's perspective or opinion on what those things signify or mean.
Then we move to discussion and implications, and this is where the authors again provide a clear description of how the results of the research contribute to the field's understanding of the issue and how the current study informs, complicates, or extends previous work. So in some ways, it's almost like a giant feedback loop, because you start out by saying this is essentially what the literature and the research seems to say about this issue. You go through the study, and then you get to the end and they say, now, what does this mean in terms of the larger context that was identified? How does this fill the gap or not? And exactly what are the implications for either future study or perhaps looking at this question, this research question, in a different way than we had originally anticipated. So the authors provide clear implications of the study and discuss broader applications of the results.
And then that leads into limitations in future work. So as I kind of hinted at before, no study can adequately account for every single factor or aspect that might be influencing your research questions or your hypothesis or what it is that you're examining. And so that could be an opportunity for you to return at the end and say, I did not account for or look at blank. So future researchers therefore could take that up and examine it in more detail, and that'll add to our knowledge in particular ways. Or there may be things that came up in the actual execution of the study where you say, I had a really hard time getting enough interview participants, so I'm really relying a lot more on the survey data here. And so we might learn more if we had a larger body of participants in the interview portion, for example. And then future work. So this can be a lot of the kinds of implications that Michael just talked about. I know in the writing across the curriculum space, there may also be pragmatic implications in terms of curriculum, pedagogy, et cetera. And those may also be aspects that particularly depending on the journal, you may want to attend to as well.
Okay, so what we're going to do now, maybe it's a good time just at least momentarily to pause for a second to ask if anybody has any questions about sort of this framework, this structure, some of the terminology that we're using that might not be clear. We do intend to sort of walk you through a couple of fairly specific research studies that we've both been engaged in to show you some of the questions that came up at each of these stages, as well as the overall process. But if anybody has any sort of quick questions, yes.
What's your feeling about this? We're doing like strictly like institutional internal research, because I know that usually excuses like the IWAC, but just as far as the method.
You mean taking place at a single institution with no expectations that it's going to be looked at or read by other people? Yeah, that's something that I would still suggest you consult your IRB about. Because at my institution, certainly any kind of research, internal or external, that involves collecting data from students or from faculty that you're going to be using, you have to go through a process to determine that it's going to be confidential, that their identities are going to be protected, and that maybe most importantly, that the students and others have given permission for you to draw from the data or the responses that they have given, and that's internal as well as external. Maybe?
Can I ask a question, or at least open up the discussion about distinction between results and discussion? Because
No.
that's not.
Yes.
I mean, I would say, I tend to think about them as, even when you're presenting the results, it's never going to be purely neutral. You're always going to be putting a perspective on how you're presenting it. But you're not necessarily getting in detail about what those results mean in terms of your research questions and in terms of what they mean in terms of the prior literature. You're saying, we asked this, here's what they said.
The reason I ask, or the reason I bring it up, is this is a question that comes with PhDs and with master's level students often, the distinction. And some supervisors will require it, others will be more lenient on it. And one of the things that I often find useful is that even in the results section or the presentation of results, there is a discussion of a specific data point or a specific highlight or a specific item. as it
Yes.
were. In the discussion section, we take a step back and look at all of those items and the implications of it. So there are discussion type phrases and items in the results section, but they are specific, they are limited in scope.
Yeah, and I think that that's perfectly correct, because sometimes just presentation of literally raw quantitative or qualitative data can make it difficult for readers to understand exactly why am I reading this and what am I supposed to be getting out of it. So providing at least some, I would say, not an analysis of those results, but at least a sort of short narrative that describes exactly what these results seem to be showing. Okay, as opposed to later discussion of the implications and the way in which it contributes to the larger research question, as Chris said.
Could we quickly go back to the title slide so the folks who just came in can see the shortened link and access the Google Drive? Do you think we can do it quickly?
Sure.
Okay, so I know it's kind of grayed out, but for those of you who just came in, it's aub.ie/RADWAC.
And will we have access to these materials beyond this conference?
Yes, that would, we'll bring that down. I'll wait a few years before I delete it from my Google.
Like a month before I
still
see
have
it.
like 4Cs 2013 still in my Google Drive. I actually had to because I don't want to buy more space and start to get too full.
Okay.
Oh, slow down.
I knew we had to get through this material quickly. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of different research projects. I'll start out by talking about one that I've been involved in for actually the last 6 or 7 years, called the Text Recycling Research Project. This is a multi-phase, which means we had several different phases, different research questions. That was funded by the National Science Foundation. And it was a study of text recycling, which is sometimes called self-plagiarism. In effect, it's essentially something when an author or set of authors recycle text that they have written and had published in previous articles or in previous poster sessions, other publications, and they include it in a new article without signifying it through the use of quotation marks or citations, but it's just literally taken almost word by word verbatim from one into the next. Okay. And in particular, this was, since it was funded through a grant that was investigating the ethics of STEM research, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, we were looking specifically at STEM writing and publishing.
And then I'll be talking about a citation analysis study that I've done on faculty development, scholarship, and writing across the curriculum research, particularly over the decade of 2012 to 2022. And this will be coming out in a journal soon. I shouldn't say it, but it's been accepted. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I thought it was one of those. Yeah, someday it'll be done.
It's close. Yeah.
So let me just give you kind of a quick overview of the Text Recycling Research Project in the context of these various stages of RAD research design. So this is something that affected us in terms of getting the initial grant application written and submitted, because several of these important components of RAD research were an absolute necessity in order to get funding. So the original grant proposal was to the National Science Foundation, in which we presented the research question or questions. We talked about the exigency. Why was this an important study to do? Why was this research that would contribute largely to the field? What value did it have and how was it unique? In other words, how did it address a gap in scholarship or a gap in research? This is something that comes into play not only in the original grant proposal as a way of convincing them to give us money and give us funding for these years, but it's also something that in some ways forecasts the kind of writing that we would have to do when we publish the results of this research. Because when you do publications, especially over the course of a long research agenda, one of the first things you have to do for readers and other researchers who may be unfamiliar with this is you have to provide the same kind of information. Why are you reading this? Why is it important? How does it apply to you? Okay, and you're going to come across different audiences in a variety of different publications. So it's placed in the context of previous publications and existing documents, such as the Committee on Publication Ethics, which is a very large organization that sees research, that oversees research publications in a wide variety of disciplines and specifically science fields. They have some policies about plagiarism, self-plagiarism, and the like. So we had to sort of refer to those documents as we were identifying our questions. We had to identify the contradictions and lack of research. And it was always necessary, as I said before, to include this kind of background and significance information in virtually every publication that we have done since. And we've probably published, one or the other team members published a dozen or so articles as a result of this research. But this is something that's kind of a requirement. I talked about how we have multiple research phases. The three major phases of this research were, first of all, to investigate attitudes, beliefs, and practices. In other words, if we're going to talk about text recycling, what do people know and think about it already? Okay. What are the attitudes that people have? Is it really all that bad? Do they look at it? Do they condemn it? Do they praise it? Do they have sort of wishy-washy values about it? How often and where does this text recycling take place in research? And then thirdly, the legal issues that were involved. Is this something that addresses issues or concerns issues of intellectual property and copyright and contract law? What are the existing laws, if any, about this kind of text recycling? In terms of the IRB and the NSF speed bumps, all of us who were involved in this, because it did involve surveys, interviews, and requesting information from individuals, we had to undergo human subjects training. The responsible and ethical conduct of research training. This was something that the NSF required. Everybody had to take the training and be certified. And probably the biggest problem that we had to do with the fact that the principal investigators for this research study were located at different institutions. And as you all know, every institution has its own IRB. And initially, we discovered that it was incredibly problematic for all of us to go to our IRBs at individual institutions because they would all look at it and read it differently and have different issues. So ultimately, there is a process by which you can ask that all of the IRBs at your institutions go under the umbrella of a single institution's IRB. And that really streamlined things a lot. So if any of you are thinking about doing cross-institutional research, just be aware that this is a headache that is likely to come up if you don't think about it or prepare for it in advance. So selection of participants and or text. As I said before, this is a STEM-focused NSF grant. So in some ways that puts certain limitations on the participants that we wanted to be able to bring into our data collection process. They had to be people who were, as you can see here, editors, editorial board members, the gatekeepers of publication, because we thought that these are the people who probably had to deal with issues of text recycling most often and in a professional capacity, and who were likely to be most sensitive to any ethical issues that might come up as a result of authors wanting to take text from a previous publication and transplant it into a new one without any explicit citation or markers. So we did this in this is all in the first phase. And I'm just going to talk about the first phase of the process because I think it's probably more illustrative of some of the issues that we've identified. There was an initial survey in which we composed a number of questions to ask people, editors and editorial board members, about their perceptions and attitudes towards text recycling in professionally published texts, journals in particular. So we wanted to make sure we had a balanced representation of journals and participants in different STEM fields. We went to a couple of databases, Sciamigo is one, and what was the one that we talked about in the last workshop?
No, scopes.
Scopes, yeah, we went to them to identify what are the journals that have the highest critical impact factor and are considered to be the most prestigious journals. We had an issue in terms of deciding how to do the survey, because if any of you are familiar with STEM journals, sometimes their editorial boards will be over 100 people long. We didn't want to send surveys to all 100, 150 editorial board members. So we just decided that we would send surveys to the top 10, the first 10 editorial board members in order to achieve some balance. So we tried to get, again, we looked at the journals. We wanted to make sure we had representation for a variety of different STEM fields. And then with the interviews, we determined the people that we interviewed on the basis of, one, whether or not they were the editor of one of these journals, and then secondly, whether or not they had indicated they were willing to be interviewed on the initial surveys that we sent out. Okay. So for the survey, we did essentially a quantitative analysis because we used surveys that relied primarily on Likert scale questions initially, with some open-ended questions asking people to elaborate on their responses if they wanted to. Okay, so we could sort of do comparisons, numerical comparisons based on their field, the number of years that they had been in the field, the number of years they'd been working as an editor, what the field, the discipline was, to see if there were any correlations among their experience, their age, the number of years they had as an editor, and the like on their responses, okay, how they responded on the Likert scales. The results of this, especially the open-ended questions, led to a discussion and determination of what were the critical issues that we wanted to get more in-depth responses to, okay? We used grounded theory, identifying the key concepts from the surveys and the interviews that we conducted. So we conducted probably, I'm trying to remember what the exact number was, something like 15 to 20 interviews. All of these interviews were transcribed. All of them were analyzed in part by discussions, saying what sorts of themes, what sorts of trends, what sorts of issues are emerging here. And we use those as a way to then engage in a more fine-grained analysis of the transcripts by putting them into a program called Deduce, if any of you are familiar with that. Okay, it's spelled D-E-D-O-O-S-E. It's a text analysis program that allows you to display text and then to code individual sections of text based on criteria and coding schemes that you set up. Okay. So then we applied and coded the interview data using Deduce. Okay. In terms of the presentation of results, we had a vast number of results. So we made a decision, at least in some of the early articles, to try to identify the results we wanted to present that really identified some of the most interesting and controversial results. Okay. So here's one of the questions that we asked. I'm just using this as one example of some of the many that we used, but this one was particularly intriguing. This is one of the questions that we asked in the survey, which said that the authors of a new text are members of a lab or long-term research project that produced the earlier text, but some of the authors of the new text were not authors of the earlier text. Okay, you see this a lot in the scientific research and the scientific literature, that they have big research teams and the authors that are working on essentially the same project, but different aspects of it. Some of them will appear in some articles, some will not appear in articles. There's a lot of movement. So the question we had is, does this affect your perception about whether or not somebody recycling text where the authors overlap but are not exactly the same, is that an ethical practice? And this is one of the interesting results. We had about a third of the respondents said, yes, it would be acceptable. About a third of them, slightly less, said, no, it would no longer be acceptable. And about a third of them said, I don't know. So, yeah, it was a pretty even split, but it was something that in some ways just helped to reinforce our original argument, which is this is an area of controversy that even experts and gatekeepers in the field don't have any clear sense of. So the final part of our research project was to try to develop policy guidelines for text recycling that would clarify some of the issues and maybe reduce the number of I don't knows into a sort of a hopefully one or the other of those two categories. So in our results and discussion, we discovered that there were in fact a wide range of attitudes and editorial strategies, clear need for guidance. Okay. And there was additional need for quantitative analysis in terms of how often does this actually occur in the scientific literature, how much of it is done from one article to the next, and also, and this ended up being a really important point, where in the article does this recycling take place? Okay, because as you might expect, give you a little forecast here, it most often takes place in methodology sections. Okay, because they're essentially using the same methodology from one article to the next with slight variation. So why would you have to rewrite the entire methodology from one article to the next if it's pretty much the same thing? Limitations in future work. This was a STEM-focused research project, so the area is wide open for humanities research, other areas and other disciplines as well, where some of these results may not apply. And I also have this note here, which is that in the limitations in future work, sometimes this section serves as a kind of en media res approach, which means this is an ongoing research study that we are conducting, and the results of this study point to the next thing that we are going to be doing. This builds on our previous findings, and this is where we or others plan to go next. So this is essentially the structure that we used in several articles that we wrote about this research project. Yes.
In those several articles, did you recycle your method section?
Yes, we did.
Did you call attention to it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
That's
did.
cool. Nice of people to be.
But it gets a little hinky in some ways because partly, I don't want to go too much into this, but we have a panel coming up later in the conference where we're talking about the recycling project. It gets a little weird because sometimes people have different definitions of what we mean by previously published. Because some journal editors would say, well, if it was in a poster session, you can't use it because that's publication. Others would say differently. Some would say, well, if it appeared in a conference proceedings, then you can't use it. Others would say differently. So there was a lot of disciplinary difference, as well as a lot of confusion about what constitutes previously published research. Yeah.
Did you find that that was different? Do you have experience in like humanities at all? So I'm just thinking that what you had just said about a poster presentation or a conference presentation being considered, oh, you've published already. And so if you wanted to write an article and get published, my sense is that in the humanities, that's not an issue. But perhaps
not
in
as
STEM,
much,
it's more
and I am a humanities person. I'm in a department of English now, but
so humanities.
you know, I will say, and again, I want to move to Chris to let him talk about his research project. In some disciplines, especially STEM disciplines, published conference proceedings are the literal pinnacle of publication, but that actually counts as a full publication. In the same way that a published journal article or book chapter would in our field. So there are disciplinary differences that sometimes arise about whether or not something is published. Okay, I'll turn it over to Chris.
So as I mentioned before, I'll be talking about a citation analysis, and I like this as a kind of a counterpoint to Michael's because this was a purely text-based study, and I think it's a good example of how you can still take a RAD approach even to technical-based studies. And so in terms of background and significance, I was really thinking about my role as is centrally involved in faculty development, and I think working with our colleagues across the curriculum can be a really central part of what many of us do if we're running a writing across the curriculum program. But our ability to do that is always going to be a little bit in question based on the vagaries of different kinds of institutional politics, or what we're seeing a lot right now is continued austerity measures. And so there's some threat to the sustainability of that work. And so I'm interested in how we can be really clear about what it is that we're actually doing when we're engaged in faculty development and writing across the curriculum, and why it matters and what its impact is. And so my research questions were, to what extent are WAC scholar administrators engaged in a concerted scholarly conversation about faculty development as an object or subject of inquiry in and of itself? And what are the sort of unexplored or underexplored avenues of research that are suggested by citation patterns in terms of how are we referencing one another when we're actually doing this kind of scholarship? So I didn't have IRB for this one because there were no human subjects involved. So I started off by looking at databases, so EBSCO and Compile and Google Scholar, using search terms like writing across the curriculum or WAC, faculty development, professional development, etc. And that's how I kind of built my initial corpus of materials, candidate and what I call candidate texts here. But I wanted to be sure that they were actually dealing substantively with faculty development. And so I would look at titles, I would look at abstracts, and sometimes I would have to look to entire articles to be sure that they were actually doing that. Sometimes it might be mentioned in an abstract, but really it was a very small portion and it wasn't really part of the inquiry that was involved in the scholarship. Then I had to, as I kind of built that, I also looked at cross-references within their own citations. So some things that didn't come up in my database research, but came up in an article, then I would go find that article and kind of repeat the same procedure until I felt like I had kind of saturated. And I knew I wanted to do this kind of network mapping approach to it. And I spent some time poking around and trying to look for software that could do visualizations of networks. And I ended up settling on Node XL, which is a plugin for Microsoft Excel. It's free and open source. And that actually, I think, contributes to replicability of this study because others can pretty easily access it and use it, so long as they have access to Microsoft Excel on their devices as well. And another reason that I liked it is that it included built-in visualization algorithms that themselves were research supported. And I was able to go and find the publications that said, here's how we data visualization scientists developed this. Now, I'm not that technical to have a clear understanding of why those are valid, but I could also see that they had been cited enough in subsequent publications that others had recognized them as valid. And then they're built into Node XL as well. So others could repeat those same algorithms. And it's pretty much as simple as clicking a button in Node XL in order to do that. But I wanted to be sure what it was that I was looking at to some extent. So I talked a little bit about selection of texts through database research, but I also had to figure out the scope of what I was actually doing here. I could have gone as far back as, say, like 1981, the Toby Fulweiler's Showing Not Telling in a Writing Workshop is maybe one of the earliest publications that focuses specifically on WAC faculty development. That probably would be more like a book-length project, and I wasn't signing up for that at this point in time. Maybe I'll get there at some point in time. So I decided to focus on that kind of most recent decade, again, thinking about this idea about recency in RAD research, and so figure out where have we been in essentially the last 10 years. It didn't get to 2023, but where have we been in the last 10 years is the seed where we're going next. Another choice that I decided to make as I was within that 10-year scope was I decided to include scholarship that was engaged with faculty as research participants, even if they weren't specifically looking at a faculty development event like a workshop or workshop series. My reason for that was that anytime we're engaged with faculty in substantive conversations about teaching and pedagogy, we're involved in faculty development. And so as research participants, that they were having that opportunity to reflect and maybe to even extend their ways of thinking about teaching. So as long as I had teaching focus or curricular focus, I included it in the corpus. So method of analysis. So I basically had to populate Node XL with all the citations and cross references. And then it produced an output that had the citations in groups, and you'll see what that looks like visually in a minute. But as I saw those groups, then I had to go back into those groups and do a thematic analysis. So I had to look across those texts and say, what is it that brings these things together as a kind of subcorpus of text? What are they kind of all talking about or discussing within this larger body of work? There were also some standalone publications. So these were publications that neither cited another one in the corpus, nor were cited by another one in the corpus. I had to think about what to do with those. And in one case, I disagreed with NodeXL. It had, because of citation, it was grouped in one cluster, but I actually thought it was a better fit for another cluster. So I'll talk about that in the publication as well. So then presentation of results. So this is the output, and I know it's small, so and the resolution is low for those of you in the room, so you can't necessarily make out the individual scholars. But as I was thinking about WAC scholar administrators as the primary audience for this, I had to think about that. And then visibility and accessibility were actually a big question for me as I was thinking about how to present these. So an example of that is I use color here, but some readers are potentially colorblind, right? And when the print version of this comes out, it's going to be in black and white. So the color can't be the only way to distinguish among the clusters. So I use shape too. So I think these are red squares. Those are outline yellow triangles. These are rings, right? And so I'm able to have multiple ways of distinguishing among the clusters visually. And then I also have just like a citation string at the bottom of the caption so that textually they can see what texts are included in there as well. The edge length, which is these arrows, that doesn't signify in terms of meaning. I just adjusted them for readability purposes so that in the published version, they're not kind of overlapping so much that you can't see who's citing whom and where. And then the other element is, as I talk about each cluster in the thematic analysis in the publication, I also do a zoomed in version of them so they can get a kind of closer view on, say, this is the faculty development and student success cluster over here. So discussion and implications, essentially what I find is that there's kind of a mixed picture of the extent to which the field is engaged in this concerted scholarly conversation about WAC faculty development. Here you can see, like, this is pretty visually tightly clustered, which suggests that, you know, maybe we are engaged in a pretty concerted conversation, and yet numerically, there are only on average 1.6 cross-references across the corpus. So that basically means that, you know, if I were one of those in the corpus, I would only be citing probably 2 others that are also engaged in talking about faculty development. So maybe that's not the thing we're actually talking about when we're doing these publications. We're often talking about something else, and WAC faculty development is just along for the ride. So we have, and I pointed out the faculty development and student success cluster that's kind of off on its own out here. And this one, it seems to me to be the one that is really ripe for continuing to take up and say more about, because again, if we're thinking about administrators who are trying to make difficult decisions about where to put resources, they might say, well, if we're putting resources into faculty, how is that helping students? We don't actually have a clear data supported sense of what that looks like in this space, at least. Right? I think we have an intuitive sense of it, and I think we have an inferential sense of it, but I think we could do a better job of grounding that in the data over time, that aggregability perspective. Limitations, this could be replicated with a different set of topics, say like writing to learn, for example, and it could be replicated in another decade to see what's changed, what new clusters have arisen, which ones have maybe fallen off. I don't do a good job of accounting for non-US contexts in this. It's pretty much all US based, and so it can be expanded in that way as well in order to enrich our understanding of what else is being done out there. in those spaces where maybe WAC isn't a term of art, but maybe there is still faculty development happening or professional development happening around writing and writing pedagogy. Okay. You introducing this or am I?
I think you are.
Okay, so in the Google Drive folder, and there's a couple copies on the table, you will have two crises of RAD Research. One is by Ann Gear and her colleagues, and one is by, is it Jason Strubakis? I can't remember his first name. Yeah. And so we each chose one of these as kind of good examples. There's some overlap topically that both deal at least a little bit with writing to learn. There's also some good differences. For example, Strubakis's piece is in a two-year college context, and so we like that as well. So what we would like you to do is read through both of them, and you can just take notes or reflect on how well you think each study accomplishes the goals of RAD research. And is there information about the methodology or the analytical framework that you would expect to see, but does not appear in our summaries, right? But we don't want to blame them. They probably did include it and we just didn't put it in there. Give you about 10 minutes to read through these. They're not that long, and then we'll have some discussion.
Okay.
Small groups or was that the next part? Oh, let's do that on the. Set it in the notes. Yeah, certainly the next part. We could data. Yes. So that kind of reaches in our calendar.
Thumbs up if you've got it set up.
Some more. Yes, more coffee.
Please make yourselves comfortable. Probably better identify as.
Yeah, I remember that.
This next part, we can do, it'll just be the last.
I will, I'll export it. You're on this page?
Yes.
I did not. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so y'all are already starting to chit chat a little bit. So what we'd like you to do is at your tables to have a brief discussion of the questions that we'll have up back on the screen in just a second. Which are how are these studies using RAD paradigm or RAD methodology, and is there information that you would expect to see that doesn't appear in our summary? So talk at your groups. Those of you who are attending online, we are working on getting breakout rooms set up. So for now, if you all could just type in the chat, and then that'll be kind of how you can have your discussion about it. And we'll have you read it out. Yeah.
I felt like it's black. Right, I just like your meditation. I don't want They have readers and they are. They tell that they feel like I have to be so yeah, and then they talk about interviews.
Yes. Yeah. So, sorry. Yes, yeah. Sorry. So we just wanted to excerpt from the policy. There's no doubt. Yeah. They don't use those as section.
Oh, sorry.
So the idea here is for you all to raise some questions. Focus on RAD approach more so than the merits or faults of these studies, or our presentation of these studies.
Possible contract. Differently.
available in the market. What has changed? Yeah. Even though. Basically, they're looking after one for their skate.
I hate that. I hate it. I feel like I'm being, unless I already have a pre-established relationship, interested in what you're selling.
Yeah.
I'll talk to different people occasionally. Yeah. I mean, even to the extent where the same person is sitting in the that's pharmaceutical conversation. I just got another one from something. It's just a modern family. Oh yeah, I know. It's just the modern version of the book right flopping by the office. They don't do any more like the lead thing.
Yeah, yeah. That's right. So they're looking at work and bringing it like 1 to 5.
Twelve 15, you start talking. Yeah, but I mean, there's a lot of things. There's possible people here want to talk. There's some of these yeah. And they start talking for about 10 minutes. Yeah. Like, I'm gonna do a survey exam. Yeah. And they say, well, let's start. Yeah. They're fine.
Yeah. I think that really any a lot of their yeah, yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and come back together as a large group and discuss these. So by quick show of hands, how many of you all got to talk about the gear article? Okay, fine. How many of you got to talk about the Strubakis article? Yeah, you did. Raise your eyes. Okay, so more people got to talk about the gear article. So why don't we start by talking about that one? And then if we have some time or if there's interest, we can talk about the other one as well. So
In case you're also interested, we are going to take a break after we do
yeah,
this.
after
Part, so
this
you can-
section.
yeah.
Okay, so in terms of the gear article, how do you all see them engaged in the RAD approach? And maybe what questions came up at your tables about how they were implementing it, or their methodology or their analysis as we presented it.
We spent a lot of time talking about how you would replicate the beer study.
Yeah.
And, we couldn't decide if it's just because we're getting a sort of summary and then maybe some other questions we have are in the article, but we just noted that there were a lot of things that were missing that you need to know if you wanted to transport this to a new context, like how were readers trained to score on the 5-point scale? And we decided what kind of work typified each, point, who decided on the codes, how are they counted with people or machines? How did they go about analyzing those systematically? So I felt like there are a lot of those little pieces. If you wanted to replicate it, you'd be like emailing them, asking all the questions.
Yeah. That's a great point from that replicability perspective. If there's not that sufficient detail presented, it creates obstacles to being able to do it again at your local institution.
It's also a little bit challenging when you're thinking about it in terms of publication, because a lot of editors are going to be looking at this article that's written about this research and saying, are my readers going to be interested in reading this information? So if you're presenting like, here's every aspect of our methodology and every set of data results, they're likely to look at that and say, can we move this to an appendix somewhere? What kind of data can be removed from the article? And if people want to look at it, they can find it somewhere else, but maybe it's not quite so important in terms of readability and comprehension to include that in this actual article itself.
That raises a question for me too about in terms of what should be included. Like in this example, the idea of, well, first of all, I don't think there is any raw data presented in terms of how things were, like it said this many things were scored, but then not which ones had 2 or 4. Like it didn't seem like it was as in depth as maybe it should have been. But besides that, when we think about what would be included, for example, would prompts be included here? Because to me, that was something that I sort of felt like, well, I kind of want to think about this letter to the grandparent, because if it's not written well, then it's probably not going to get people to apply the skill you're supposed to be like measuring, so because I wondered like who writes, letters to their or emails to their grandparents and includes statistical analysis. But that it just didn't seem like the right math, so I felt like I didn't see that prompt. But would it be like appropriate to include the prompt and when we talk about that like what gets in and what doesn't get in?
I think so, and I mean, we don't want to get too much into being apologists for these two pieces, but they did have the prompts in there.
Okay.
But I think like in the more abstract sense, if it's a key part of the thing that you're studying, the phenomenon, then I think it needs to be there in as much detail as is allowable, or in order again for the replication, right? If you had this particular statistics class that was in, I think, nursing. At your institution, if that was taught and you wanted to replicate it with them, yeah, you would need the prompts for sure.
No question here, yes.
Yeah, well, and replication, good. But it seems to me that there are kinds of scholarship where it's not just about replicating a study, but sort of developing and refining a question. So the conclusions that she reaches are interesting here. To me as somebody in the humanities, and so I could imagine doing a study which would follow up on that, not by trying to replicate exactly what she finds, but taking the distinction that she introduces, say, from uptake of disciplinary knowledge and uptake of genre knowledge, developing those through a somewhat different study that would still connect with her. That doesn't fit in the category of replication.
It doesn't, but that does fit in aggregation. So I think the other element, I think those two things there can be meaning more into one than the other, or it can be doing both, right? The most kind of robust are probably doing some element of both of them. Yeah.
I do, so I feel like
the way that they talk about what they're measuring and then what their implications are, and this may be just because I'm not as much in the field, like, seems kind of mushy. So say like, and this gets to what like the previous commenter was saying, because how students understand and take up such assignments. But then like at the end, you know, they're talking about genre knowledge and so forth, which is related, but to me, that's more focused on student learning. And then the ending is focused on teaching. Or am I like missing like a huge chunk of stuff?
You're saying the same thing. It's like,
I would say it feels like a gigantic entity, like lots of little pieces. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it literally is, right? Like kind of a lot. But yes, I get your point. A thing that, so I was the one who put this together, and the thing that I left out, I think, was a fair amount. There's also an interview portion here that I didn't really account for. And so that's where they do start getting much more into that question of how students conceptualize the uptake of these assignments. And then I read that last portion as then being more about the implications that stem from how they do that as well. So that's a good question though, about to what extent are we getting back to that original question or not? If it's mushy, then you know you may have some rhetorical work to do. Magnus,
Well, I might want, might want to get to agreeable because, and again, it might be a question too, if there are elements that you let out. Because there isn't an awful lot of agreeable in the summary that we read. And in rather the opposite, in fact, they're overstating what they've done. They haven't answered their question, and the title is completely out of the book. So, but it is, as we heard, it is agreeable. It generates a follow-up study and among many of us. So it has that potential. Do they discuss that? Do they let on that in the paper? Because you can articulate your agreeable, or you can have it, but it needs pinpoint.
Yeah, I'll have to. I actually can't answer that question. I'll have to go back and look at the probably to see that and look at.
Well, it starts already in the introduction.
Yeah, for sure.
If it's going to be agreeable, it starts already in the introduction.
Yeah, that's right. It doesn't just come to the end.
No.
Yeah, it's in how the whole thing is set up as well.
Yeah, there's not an awful lot of information that's provided in this précis about, you know, sort of how this is placed within the discipline and previous research. But you can sort of see what likely was there, which was that there's a lot of discussion, a lot of emphasis on writing to learn assignments, especially in things like STEM fields and sciences and as well as the humanities. But this is aggregable in the sense that it's saying this seems to be a common trope or common knowledge among people who are teaching WAC and promoting this as an activity in their classes. But in fact, it's much more nuanced than that. And let's study what some of the nuances would be, such as it's not a matter of just writing to a different audience like your grandparents as a way of getting students to think about how to consider audience analysis and how to write for different people and uptake the information more with sort of enhanced retention. If you're constructing an audience that really has no place whatsoever for what it is that you're asking them to do, you're not contributing to their learning process, you're just making them more confused. And they're not likely to do as well. So that gets to the conclusion, which is we need to look at the issue of genre and genre uptake, and when would it be appropriate to include this information for a specific audience that you write to, other than a professional colleague or a professional journal.
But from a RAD perspective, and I know you were not the editor of the web journal, but I mean, the title and the research question is for a meta-analysis, and they're not doing a meta-analysis. This should be rejected at day one. This should be changed at day one. It's a good study.
Incidentally,
but they're talking about writing in general, and that's not what they're doing. That's not what they're studying. They're studying a specific genre, to specific prompts, specific content. And that's not their research question.
So incidentally, and maybe this is, maybe you're actually getting at something. So not the exact same authors, but a significant number of them did publish a meta-analysis of writing to learn in written communication within a year of this.
Right.
And so maybe some of that, what you're sussing out is like, they had already done that thinking. And so it's sort of implicit in what you see here.
Yeah, that actually gets to a real interesting point, because when I talk to students about research, we talk about them stepping into an ongoing conversation and the need to understand where they're stepping in. And it seems to me that a conversation that unfolds in a journal can make some assumptions about not having to go back over everything that's already situated itself without having to go back over things that have already been said.
Yeah, and I think that's, the background and significance section, you do have to curate what you're going to be pulling out. We were talking about this morning, actually, about how do we make clear why we're selecting and drawing on the literature and the prior research that we're drawing on. What's the intellectual purpose behind that? And in this case, one of those purposes may be that prior research either is making assumptions or establishing theories or raising questions that haven't been answered yet. And that's why you may dig into that.
It'd be nice though, just to go back to your point about like student success, if people like did breadcrumbs, like sentences that would go back to like really key concepts that would be explainable to outside audiences very easily.
Yeah. Love that. I'm gonna do. I think the more that we could be doing that work, that also would help with aggregability too. And that sort of gets at the idea of jargon, right? Disciplinary terms or concepts that maybe we evoke, believing that our audience understands them, but maybe there's more than what needs to be done there. How about the other one? You're the bad teacher. What did you think?
Yes.
I think, the issue I take is with the statistical analysis happening here and the methods of analysis. In that, the meeting was presented, right? And, right, on our Likert scale would fall somewhere between and agree, right? So that tells me that maybe there's a mode situation going on where it was more 1s and 5s, right? Very disparate, and I don't see that conversation happening here. Right, yeah, no standard deviation. I don't know if they did or statistical significance, right? So that's where I'm like, maybe the data actually shows more for their argument than it does.
Got it.
Yeah.
I looked at both articles more skimming for whether or not they met the RAD goals. And I felt like in comparison to the year, it kind of hit the point more easily. Like it was just more explicit, many places about like exigent purpose all throughout that you could replicate the study more easily. I did not look in detail at the results of the writings at all to know whether they got good data from it, but at least they presented the data. And then the discussion and the analysis was separate from it, unlike the gear. So I kind of just looked at them comparatively to whether or not they achieved.
Yeah, and if you read through the Strumbach's piece, one of the things you'll see is that there's like one place in particular where there's a note from me saying they didn't include this information, just in case you're curious and wanted to know.
The survey is up there, so if you wanted to replicate.
Right,
the
you
survey,
couldn't replicate it.
Yeah, it wasn't there. It wasn't there.
I was just gonna say that to your point, a lot, aside from the survey, the way that those results were arrived at is visible. So you could, if you were, trying to replicate this at your own institution, you could say, I'm not going to do it this way, right? I'm going to do a standard deviation. I'm going to work with a statistician. Because there's probably a better way to present the results of the survey. But yeah, without the survey itself, you can't replicate. It's not replicable at all.
I think everybody's probably just about ready for a break.
Yeah.
So let's take 10 minutes and then we'll come back for the next portion. Thanks, everybody.
I think we have Good discussion so far.
Anyway,
There are 7 folks online, well, 6 actually, and I don't know if they've been putting stuff in the chat or not. I was gonna ask her. Has the folks online been putting stuff in the chat? Okay.
I also have.
Oh, okay.
Coming back.
Yeah, it's right there. On the coast. Thank you. It's already.
I'm glad it's so fun. We're enjoying. Yeah.
The second one, I kept going back and forth and like, did it do this? Did it do that? Like,
Yeah, we went back and forth on like, do we do both? Do we people select one or the other? And sounds like people kind of.
and I think that's case scenario. So when I look at this in actually with the. That's basically this, right? Was that?
Yeah, I think that's the idea. You know, I think with all of this, it's a mindset. The more transparent. And sometimes there's some places where you're saying, well, I didn't do that. You're able to hold, or I didn't do this, you know.
That's all. Was trying to get the like.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, I appreciate that. And in terms of that, not really, like significant extension.
Lots of us.
Wow, that's why you put it in. It's so good, like, well, I need it by this day, so how about that? And no, it was too, it's kind of a. Surprised me about that, and so, this summer, we both were, you know, proud about like, went well here, you know, but I didn't, you know, think that, you know, that was going to turn that quickly, so,
Leaves a little high and dry.
well, I mean, we're still in touch, so, you know, but I think that for me, like, hearing some of the stuff that folks are saying about this, like, she really helps me with the background and a lot of the statistical stuff and methods and all that, so she kind of like, we talked it through, but she was like, I think this makes sense, I think that makes sense, and I was like, okay, sounds good, like, so I just hoping that, like, it's enough for me to, like, you know, because I think that, again, I was thinking also about that, the shared text idea, right? Whereas like there's like most of this, she wrote most of the methods section because she's knew most about it. And so she just like, you know, and so I was like, okay, you know, but now I'm looking at it like, gosh, my game was on it, but like there's a lot of stuff here that I have to like really go back in and be like, how did we, like, what did we do, you know, what is it to me, this and that, and it's just not good. So I'm gonna work on it. So, thank you.
I appreciate your work on it too.
Well, it's learning a lot already, so that's perfect. Good. Just like being worlds apart. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
We actually don't have them in the PowerPoint.
But you had created a Google Doc.
Yes. So what I'll do is I'm gonna switch to share that.
Which is the,
Yeah, it'll be working. Yeah, it's quite supposed to land.
that'll be interesting. This is the working space for institutional.
I go to Massachusetts,
Yes.
and then we do the overnight to Dublin and then. Five zones, and then from there, we hop 3 more for a little bit.
Oh, wow.
And my parents-in-law are in Istanbul. I spend my time juggling in my head between which of the, you know, home is GMT -8. My mother and grandfather are GMT -5. And then you're in GMT, and my in-laws are in +3. So it becomes this like, that's a little confusing. Yes. Yeah. My new theory is that all working is happening at night. Because going back is easier. Right, like at 8 o'clock in the morning, in Hawaii, for the East Coast people, it's 1 p.m. They're on the way. Whereas for me right now, 8 o'clock in the morning, is about 6 o'clock in the morning. So it's pretty simple. I think you may have a minority. Oh, wow.
And are you introducing this? So, okay, I'll manipulate
So
the
it's gonna be an all day.
projector or something. I'll bring up the, I'll project the Google Drive. Okay, there, we're gonna kind of show people where the two.
I think we're talking in terms of signing data for virtual students. There's 1, 4, and then the online people.
Yeah, even as everybody, right now, there's one person online. They actually trickle away.
I asked the doctor, I had the same thing. I have to read it again.
Not unexpected.
Yeah, I think you're right, but yeah, I think it's just to show that for presentations, I think hybrid's good. I think the workshops, especially this long of a workshop, if it were an hour, yeah, you'd probably stick around.
Yeah, I think the people probably think is that after they've attended through, you know, our presentation and first discussion.
Right, especially with having a link to the materials.
I certainly understand that because I attended WAC business meeting. You know, and I'll sit through the business meeting and I'll look at the report on the finances and how things are going, but as soon as I got it, now we're gonna have breakout groups and discussions. It's like, nah, it's too late.
Yeah, right.
I
Tired.
got cognitive brain drain. So.
Yeah, I definitely, I stuck around, but I was also like, should I stick around or should I just go? Tired, I've got a lot to do.
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah, you know. I can't help myself.
They've got, you know, yeah. It's not, although I think it's not even mixing.
One more minute.
Yeah. I was trying to get a walk.
Different range, I don't know. Yeah, okay, so that is definitely staying. But you do not know what I'm talking about. So, okay. So then I.
Okay, everybody, I think we're gonna try to get together, do the workshop here. Call you all back to your seats. So we certainly appreciate the fact that you've been willing to listen to us a lot at the very beginning and also take a look at some published WAC research, RAD research, and discuss it at your table. But now we're going to give you an application task. This is something that we're going to ask you to do. We have developed a scenario for you to take a look at. And the name of the file in the Google Drive that you should go to is Institutional Scenario for RAD Research.
And I've got it up on the screen here.
So what this does is it presents you with an institutional context, as well as sort of a framework or a beginning of a research study or an area of inquiry. Now, one of the things that you'll notice when you take a look at this context and the scenario that we provide you is that there are likely many different kinds of research studies that you could design that would answer at least some of the questions that are being posed to you as a WAC administrator. So part of your task is at your groups in your tables to decide what kind of a RAD study are you going to design in order to answer one or more of the research questions which are available to you. And also, what sorts of data would you need to collect in addition to the data that you know is available as listed in the scenario? Because you'll say, you know, this might be useful and a good source of information and data, but in terms of answering the kinds of questions that we have, we need to collect other kinds of data as well. So your task here is in your group to decide what is the specific research question or questions that you want to design, what's the RAD approach that you want to take, and what kinds of data are you going to collect that would support the answers to the questions that you have. Okay. So we also have a place, a Google Doc, for you to write your responses. So somebody at your table or people at your table are going to be responsible for putting things into this Google Doc. It's called Working Space for Institutional Scenario. We have it divided up into groups and we have the 5 questions. What's your research question? Key elements of the study design. What kinds of data do you need? What challenges come up as you plan it, and what else would support your study design? This is going to be group number 1 at this table, group number 2, group number 3, group number 4, and our online attendees will be group number 5. So as you conduct your discussion and talk about this, answer these questions in the Google Doc for your group. Yes, ma'am.
Stupid foreigner question.
We're gonna write it in English.
It says in the scenario that you have a 1 course release. I need to know what resources we have when we design this. So what does that mean?
You have.
How much
That's a question you have to answer. What resources do you need?
So my colleagues will know that.
Yes.
I mean, you're asking what a
Well, one course release
That's
means,
basically what I'm at.
Yeah, okay, so course release means, so if a standard teaching load at your institution would be a 2-2, instead you have a 2 courses and 2 courses each semester instead you have 2-1.
And the writing coordinator, the coordinator of the writing system would have a 2-2 regularly.
it depends a lot. Sometimes that might be using a 5-5 to a 5. Okay, so if you would read through the scenario, talk about it at your groups. We'll give you about 15 minutes or so, 15, 20, depending upon how people go. And then we'll ask you to share your responses.
Yeah. One thing that we can try and think
Got that, and then, you'll be checking your documents out there.
Yeah.
And then. Right on.
Are you taking notes now?
We say how long we were given them?
I said 15, 20 minutes if you need it.
Yeah. 20 minutes, I think would be good. Depending on the group, some of these groups, they get extended for a long time.
This would be a very.
I'm also gonna plug.
Maybe we could.
Developing something from their presentation. I've got some. Good chance to see. Potential contributions. Sounds great.
You may include the upper level.
Upper level undergrad.
Upper level undergrads and grads.
Senior graduating, which majors just possibly only. All workshops. Yeah. It is, it's really hard, it's very hard.
Well, that could be a research question. What kind of training? What kind of doing? Well, actually, it's like, yeah,
I like the benefit of it. But I don't know why you can do that in the back.
I just.
Yeah.
You at least have some comparison.
And that's the reason behind the plan.
The bonus you could just prove it. What kind of training exactly, you could show that. How did that? Yeah.
Exception and. Might go there.
There and then decide if you want to stay.
And I look at it, there's at least a New York style piece of this right now. And it looked like there were some other. Yeah. She got that. Yeah, so did Becky, she started carrying too, and she enjoyed it. Good. I just had tacos. I got the that could be dangerous. Yeah. I know it's tiny. Yeah. When I was at Alabama for a master's, there was an Italian place that would do bottles of wine. Like $5. They also had the best rosemary, fresh baked rosemary loaves of bread, rosemary Italian bread, and like I still never had bread like that. It was delicious, and the place closed down. Like, so it goes.
A number of years ago, when I was on sabbatical, I did some writing, I needed to kind of
Yeah.
And one of the things that we do is whatever. And we would just go there.
When we said all you could eat, we didn't need them all.
Yeah.
We sort of expected maybe things to be shared, great people. What do you like to put on the oysters? You just do them straight up.
I do them straight up.
Yeah.
Maybe a little horseradish.
I like horseradish. I like, I'll put anything really. I like to put lemon juice on it. Or anything. We got, when we did our annual beach house trip a few years back. Other than my oldest daughter, she's always been in the so I called my best friend. I said, "Hey, just grab some fresh oysters for him." He did. He brought them over. We shocked them, and so I showed her, how to do it. And she did it. It's right back out again. So you're not supposed to leave it in your mouth. Swallow it. Yeah. I just will never forget the look on her fingers. She's like, "You're good." Oh wait, I don't think I like it after all.
By the idea of eating oysters, he said it looks like you're eating slime.
Yeah. My wife doesn't, she can't do it. Not interested. She loves seafood. She doesn't want to do it. Oh, well.
No, that's the way I look at it. You don't like them? Cool. I'm not seeing lots of responses.
Yeah. Lee has got some contact.
Where That actually kind of still going. And the entire workshop, I think, yeah. What you say?
Okay, just a quick reminder to every one of the groups that you are supposed to be posting some resources in the Google Doc. Group number 3, you're our star table right now. Good job.
That's more. So then not. Like, well, and depending on what it is. Yeah. I'm running up the battery. When I'm doing another tutoring, I'm saying other program, but I will try to like turn it. I really understand there's sort of like asking them to get on pretty good. I hate the concrete papers, but I was trying to think like, hey, well, if I were in this world, that would be so. What would I be? Have you thought about? Getting the news is about.
Studying psychology.
And one thing I wonder is like. And this is, how we're gonna do it, so how I would hire the more.
So it's a little bit of a smaller group than you were expecting. We could have them each share out what they were thinking of.
What are the entrance perceptions for that?
Well, that takes much time.
So
I don't know if they work together.
walk us through.
Maybe nothing with the
Yeah, I mean, our discussion questions were, yeah, maybe we could lean into the slide discussion question to what challenges or issues came up for you, what else do you need? Kind of stuff, I don't know.
Allocate maybe 15 minutes. Think about or my groups and how they can do it. That's the business like. So that is. Maybe we. Then we say they're going to be group. And can just about 5 minutes or so talk about. Study. What were your responses? It's a way of just kind of talking, see if there are any commonalities across tables and and the like, and then we can open. Discussion. Thinking about.
That's great. Okay, yeah.
You don't have to why I. No, but I, you go. Show how they continue learning. So I think that was talking about.
No, it's just
It's bad storm both in Auburn. Actually, she's got one lesson starting at 2. Eastern, or sorry, Central, so for like in an hour. I should be able to do Keep one more year, a little bit stronger, so we're. That's what strength, like just being strong. No, she's all about gymnastics. That's what she wants. She's very single-minded about it. Constantly, practicing in the living room, or yard. She's got a real knack for it. She's very. So my whole thing is just like, don't be frustrated when you can't do something yet. You just have to practice and learn. So helping her have a little humility. Yeah, she's so good at like being able to get stuff quickly.
One of my daughters was in gymnastics for a while, but they also try to push them into gymnastics.
She wants to be, she just wants to be bad. Yeah. So she's already on the team, like the level 1 team. When are we going to get through competition? Wow. Yeah, she's all about it.
My daughter was just exactly the opposite. I want to do it for the exercise, for the movement, to have fun. And then once they start, getting into, you have to train and you have to, it's a number of times, and you have to do it in front of an audience. And she was like, it's just actually, not what I think.
For sure. I was never a competitive player because, wife Lacey, she's very competitive, but she was good because she wanted soccer player. Like had been in Olympic development at one point, so I think I learned something.
What made her decide not to pursue that?
Her sophomore year of college, she got burned in college. She had a bad coach, and she was a conflict major, and she was like, "This is not fun anymore." So when it stopped being fun, it's enjoyable. She was at Free State, and then she decided.
Yeah, that would be a challenge.
Yeah. When I was in my PhD, she was finishing up undergrad.
Worked out well.
Yeah, it really did. Much longer than we want to give them.
I guess that's.
Yeah, unless they put it further down.
I'm sort of intrigued by this phrase. Look for links in the other side.
That makes sense.
I'm not sure what that. Maybe, trying to make it sound like. Abstract,
Yeah, we used to call that word clearing. I'm gonna get started in this. Or like this is the beginning of time introduction.
Yeah.
So it's very years ago.
Away, you start reading this text and it goes on for a paragraph. I haven't decided yet.
And I know you've seen the Calvin Hobbes version of it too. There's Calvin writing an academic paper, and it's not like the most jargony title ever. It's like academia, here I come.
You're never gonna know. And I was assuming that I would have right after.
No, I'm not.
Okay, if your groups want to take a minute or two to sort of wrap up, put any last comments.
But can we provide some data or information and outreach or? We don't. Okay, everybody, if we can reconvene as a large group here. Fortunately, I think we have enough time for us to be able to at least briefly go around to each one of the groups. Have you talk for just about 5 minutes, describing the study, describing the responses to the questions that you've got. And that way, everybody will kind of get a sense of how each table and each group responded to these issues similarly and differently. Then we'll have a larger group discussion before we move on to the final activity. Make sense? Work for you?
But we were hoping you'd run out of time.
And we'll start with this. No, we'll start with group number 1 over here. That'll give you guys time to catch up. Okay, so do you want to share with us what your research study is and the research question you want to address?
I think our stuff is fairly short, so you might get to take this.
That's totally fine.
We were really just trying to grapple with the idea of what that.
Can we listen, show due respect here?
Yeah.
We were trying to grapple with that idea of academic achievement and what that means and the stuff that we already have, right? Like how can we make use of what materials we have, the grades, or is it collecting syllabi? Is it surveying people about the grades they assign, those types of things? Am I on the right track here? Okay, so we really kind of just got stuck there, right? Thinking about, the provost has this idea. They've said X, right? Academic achievement, how's it measured due to our vertical curriculum? And we need to figure out what academic achievement is, how that vertical curriculum relates, and also like the philosophies behind that curriculum before we can even get started.
And so we thought about sort of a couple of like sub research questions being what perceived need is that vertical curriculum filling in the first place? Because obviously the provost has some sort of agenda or vision for what a vertical writing curriculum would ultimately, what purpose that would serve at the institution. And I was really intrigued by and I think we talked a lot about the assessment data, not just the grades, but like what conversations led to the assessment data that's been collected, how are our faculty sort of agreeing on common definitions of effective writing in their discipline. And if we have access to that data, that's probably going to tell us a lot more than just final grades in the class. And so if we could pair that with some interviews with faculty as well as some surveys and interviews with students to get an understanding of how they perceive their academic success in the program. That might give us at least a starting point to tell the provost, okay, here's at least what folks who are in the program, both teaching and learning, see as effective or see as filling a perceived need. That's about as far as we got.
I think right as time ran out on this, we're thinking about maybe looking at, is there any way that we can measure? And the answer really is time ran out and we don't know. But can we measure how these students are also doing in other classes, how it's contributing to their sort of overall education? There's some way of thinking about that. Because if it's not just to do the pilot study inside, but to move it into other departments, then that would be an interesting.
Yeah, and you should raise an interesting question about the aspect of writing development over time, and it's not something that occurs only in one class, only in a structured sequence of writing assignments. But there are things that are happening in all of their courses and all of their curriculum. How do you tease out the effect that the writing intensive psychology curriculum or course is having on their writing? So that is an interesting challenge for this kind of research. How about group two?
I think that pretty much is what we grappled with the
Yeah.
whole time.
That's
Like,
right.
I think like part of it is it's such a short time, like one course release doesn't really, like we weren't sure what the exact timeline would be that we could get a lot of information from that. So we talked around a lot of things. And I don't know that we even at this point really came to what is the research question, so.
I think we got really stuck on whether or not we needed to do a study just of psychology, which is what we have in front of us, or whether or not, like, to get anything useful out of this, we needed to compare it to another similar field that did not have, you know, these vertical, also recognizing, you know, that just adds. We have one course release that shows us the timeline.
Yeah.
Just jump in here. I don't think this, what the provost wants is doable. And I think we've got to have a comparison group of some kind.
And this is awesome gift. I wish the provost at my school would come up, this is super similar to my school. And I'm like, I wouldn't have been ready to do it, sorry, it's not, it's unethical, but I would do whatever it took to kind of make sure that like there was something that was produced that showed something that was helpful about writing, and I'm sure it would, you could.
Yeah.
You know, like without having to answer every single question or have it be like impeccable. So I guess like, was the balancing point between like expediency? This reminds me of like the summer of the pandemic when they took away our campus-wide software and they kind of pitted all the units against each other and didn't give us a budget and said, go find and do software. And people and like, and they, people,
Scavenger hunt.
yeah, with no budget, you know, and I was like, well, I know about WC Online, and that's what ended up happening because we didn't get a new software. So anyway, I feel like I've lived some version of this, but it's nice that this is like a positive version of what writing.
Yeah, and I think that the issue of resources that you raise here is a really important one for doing research like this, especially given the timeline and the expediency. And it's like, how can we come up with something meaningful, a research study that is going to be providing at least some data and information, given the constraints that we have to operate under. And sometimes as researchers, we know that can be a fundamental challenge because our workloads are already overburdened. Our administrative duties are likely, taking a lot of our time. So how can we actually respond to this inquiry? And I think that's kind of what we're trying to get at with this scenario, which is, you have to think about it not just in terms of what is my research question and how do I go about conducting a study, but what data do I have available? What data do I need in order to do this? What's the scope of the research problem and the research question? What can be done and what are my first and then next steps?
And I think that you've already kind of pointed out the way that a project like this can grow and become very like monstrous in terms of its potential scope. And I actually think one benefit of the RAD approach is that actually it gives you some permission to meaningfully narrow and say, yeah, I could look at all that. To really answer this question, I probably have to look at all that, right? But if I can slice it up a little bit more, maybe I can get something that's meaningful and say, we'll deal with those other questions next.
How about group number 3?
When a little rose, you want to talk about your?
So we decided to get rid of your scenario and just talk about our We talked about our own institutions and like, what would a RAD study look like if we all collaborated on it?
Cool.
And so I was telling you about preview of our presentation tomorrow. We have peer reviews that were collected from graduate students in a multidisciplinary course, mostly made up of STEM students. And so we talked about the kind of challenges of peer review, especially when students are higher up in their disciplines and have a lot of disciplinary knowledge and want people with disciplinary knowledge to give them that feedback. And just the challenges of peer review in general, of giving critiques and things to other people, or what you call the mutual admiration club. Good job, everybody. So we kind of designed a RAD study sort of around that. When we thought of a multi-phase research study across multiple institutions in different continents. So we might have a couple of challenges. But we thought about what kind of training for student peer review is occurring, and that kind of focuses on instructors. So thinking about maybe like a survey or analysis of materials that they use to train students about peer review. And then what are we seeing when peer reviews, like we collect what students have done, kind of how would we analyze them and code them for certain aspects of like things like disciplinary knowledge, how do they address one another, concrete suggestions, or abstract banality, favorite term. We have a higher order concerns and lower order concerns. So look, and each of those might give us sort of a different kind of research question to examine.
So was part of the reason for your deciding to be rebellious, that you looked at the context and the scenario and say, can't be done? Won't work.
Can't relate.
Yeah, can't relate.
So we were thinking quite that concretely about the scenario.
Okay, how about this group? Did you guys have a chance to catch up?
Well, we didn't get to our research question, but we had a lot of good discussion.
Okay.
So we addressed 3 possible models of looking at this. One would be to compare it with other disciplines, which we were not mandated to do. And so we had to shove that aside. 2, we wondered about the final, the 3 years of assessment, faculty assessment, whether that would give us enough data to do something with, but probably we would want to add something there. So that would be like a program internal data. And then the other was to look at graduates who had exited the psychology program and to see how well, say, if they're in grad school, for instance, how well they felt served them. And then that would be another way of looking at academic benefits, because our discussion then began to revolve around what do we mean by academic benefits? What do they look like, and how might we measure them? And then we had, we also fell into the ditch of the campus politics here. And the buy-in and the bias of the administrator who wants us to do the Bible study.
Yeah, because there is a fairly clear sense that the directive that you're being given is, this looks really bright and shiny and fascinating. I want you to prove to everybody that this is something that's good. Okay, because this is what I want to see.
And one of the things we talked about is the 15 million questions we would have for the provost before we even design the stuff. You know, and the questions we would have about things like, how good is that assessment data? What is the basis of that assessment data? What did they do? How did they operationalize? What did they look at? You know, like I wouldn't design a study until I had their actual assessment report in hand and knew what I could already use. Because I would want to build from that. I mean, if it's a disaster, then okay, I wouldn't have anything to build from it. If I want something to build from there, then it would make sense to build from that.
Yeah.
But yeah, at the same time, we were told by the provost, come up with a positive answer here.
One thing that is interesting about the scenario is a combination of quantitative data with qualitative data. Because in what you're proposing, there's a lot of quantitative data, and if that's aggregated over the course of 3 years or 4 years, if we take that and compare it to the assessment data, we also collect qualitative data and run it across, then that would be a very interesting study.
Yes, this might be something, yeah, where you have collecting quantitative and qualitative in order to triangulate and actually come up with a more persuasive argument.
Right, and actually see or the results could point to what is an effective, and even that can help revise the outcomes, the 4 outcomes that are listed there. Maybe in some areas, there's a continuous scoring above what's expected. Let's say, I mean, a lot of students, when they come to my class, it's like a sequence, they say, I got the AP or MLA covered. That's not my main concern. That's one of, I mean, I wanted to do that, but that's not the first thing that I ask them when it comes to writing knowledge and communication. So let's say, what if the results show that everyone scores really high on APA, but then very low on critical thinking? You can correctly cite that APA, and you can use AI technology.
Sounds like AI.
Well, so that's one of the reasons why we could even have a conversation about how these outcomes speak to each other. Because correctness in APA style does not demonstrate critical thinking.
So let me tease out a couple of questions or issues here, and one of them has to do with what it is that you were being asked to do within a particular timeline. And the second part is the data that you are told that you have available. Okay, so on the one hand, you're being posed with a situation, a scenario by the provost, that I'm looking for you to do a research study that demonstrates the effectiveness of this scaffolded sequenced writing development program in the psychology department to show, in fact, that students do develop as writers in the discipline by the time they reach their senior capstone project, and to do this within a relatively short period of time. Okay, so the first question is, how reasonable is that request? And then the second part is you're being told that you have final grades from students in each of these 4 courses. How useful or valuable is that data in order to answer the question that you're being posed with? Okay. So let's start with the first one, because I know that this group had some issues with that timeline. Okay, and you're absolutely right. Politics do come into this. Because how do you tell the provost, sorry, can't be done, not reasonable?
Can we hear from the
Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't think anybody is left online, or
There's one.
that's
That's
cool.
not just you.
Yeah.
But
Thank you for trying to.
Yes. Yes.
Well, I want to go to what Chris said about the study is just growing, suddenly becoming massive, and I think that's a real danger, but I think there's a danger on the other side where you try to accommodate a request for a study, and what you come up with is not reliable, and, this kind of request sort of invites kinds of assessment that are just self-promotion or a desire to keep things, going competition between departments. I think there's a real danger of taking this in too literal a way. And so for me, an important first step would be to say, here's what we would need to do to have a reliable study. My own impulse would be to sort of go meta and go out there and look at studies on vertical writing models and see what we could learn from those.
One of the challenges I think with grades is that evidently we have full-time faculty, we have part-time faculty, and students coming from different, the grades being given, there is, when we grade for class, we don't have that integrated reliability, which is grading the paper for the students. And as we know, I grade my students with an emotional factor, the fact that I know where they're coming from, they're my student, they're in my classes, while the same paper is being graded by someone that does not know the student. It's very different, right? So, there is that subjectivity that comes into place when it comes to grades based on how well we know the students, based on part-time, full-time, who has more time, like, part-time faculty who teach courses at multiple institutions and the time they devote to grading and feedback and so on. I mean, feedback here doesn't come into play, but so I think those are, I would say, my concerns. And even, yeah, so because for assessment, there has to be that rater reliability, but for grades, we don't need that.
I just have a question for you two, and maybe everyone, and maybe a little share. One is that, is there research that shows correlation at least between writing enhancement to courses and grades? I would love to see that. If there's some sort of national body of research that shows or doesn't show the correlation, please let me know. I'd love to read it. And then I just want to share that I'm thinking about this. I've actually done 3 assessments that were mostly about assessing, the work, coding or something, but we did look at grades, 3 separate assessments, and all 3 of them, the students did get higher grades. So, I don't know what that says, but it's interesting. And I definitely would never just look at grades.
Yeah.
So.
I'm not aware of any such study, I think, for precisely the reasons that we're pointing out here about the questions that come up about reliability of grades as an indicator of student learning. I know locally at Auburn, students' GPAs pretty much correlate exactly with their ACT scores and their high school GPAs. And so that just goes to show that students are pretty consistent all along in what they're doing and how they're succeeding. So I think the question that I would want to ask is, what could grades be useful for in this kind of study? Could we make use of them in some way while recognizing the limitations?
I'll jump in just kind of real quickly to respond in part to the question here. There's an interesting pair of studies that were done by Neil Lerner. If you're familiar with him, one of them was called Counting Beans and Bean Counting. And I forget what the title of the other article was, but in essence, his first article was one that was trying to make a correlation or a connection between students visiting the writing center and the grades that they got in the courses that they were visiting the writing center for. And he sort of showed that, he did this kind of analysis that there does seem to be a connection between the number of times students visit the writing center and what their final grades were. And then he wrote a follow-up article after that saying, now that I thought about it, my first article was wrong. Which is to say that it's looking at final grades and those sorts of things. There are so many other factors that come into play that it's really impossible to say with any degree of confidence and validity and reliability that it's specifically because they went to the writing center that they ended up getting higher grades in whatever course they happen to be taking. So, as you're both saying, the issue of looking at final grades is probably not the best scale or criterion to use as a way of measuring whether or not students' writing ability in or out of a discipline has improved as a result of having taken those writing intensive courses. You need to look at other things. All of that.
Now, shoot me down. This is shoot down, but not literally. What have you found on transfers? Like, we've got almost half our student body now is transfers. What if we were able to break out the grades based on whether they had or had not had the full sequence at your school?
So at Auburn,
That might show something.
at Auburn, transfer students by and large had lower GPAs than the students who started at the first year. So it's already skewed data from the beginning. Yeah.
I was gonna say, there's a really interesting, probably justice-oriented approach that you could run here. Cause I might run the numbers on grades just to see who is achieving academic success in that department and how is that being defined? Like, cause I was thinking about this issue of transfer students, students of color, first gen students. And I would kind of just see like because what the thing that ACT correlates with is also the number of bathrooms in your house. Meaning
Socioeconomic status,
right?
yeah.
Yes, that's what it correlates. And so like,
So I may not report this to the provost exactly. But it would be sort of interesting to see, and I think actually presented in the right way, the department might actually take action on this kind of thing. If there is a sort of disparity between how grades are being assigned in classes, if there is a trend, I would look for it and see if it's possible.
Jen, were you gonna say something a minute ago?
I was just gonna, say that in terms of how to use that information about the grades, that, I think probably the best first step now when like really trying to think it out is, for this level, is to say like, how are the grades broken down, how they connect to these objectives, right? Like, because if you could say, in the sophomore level, students are supposed to compose a high quality review of relevant psychology literature. Could we look at like, with what part of that grade is assigned to that in a sense, and be able to maybe pull some information out of that. So we really have to start with understanding how the faculty broke down those grades and in what ways do they measure that compared to these outcomes.
Yeah.
So that could be a possible way.
I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I was curious to know if, for example, student A, B, C, these three students got A, but how do you know, or we know that these three students have the same levels or same stages of development in their writing? And also there are differences in writing curriculum in different disciplines. Like if we got those scores or grades from psychology department, and how can we formulate something or formulate a study based on those writing curriculum that can be applied into English department students or students from like the engineering departments. So these are different nuances that also we have to think about. So not all the A grades, So not all the A graders are not accomplished or great writers. Because someone has a grade, yes, he can write greatly, but there is another person who also got a grade, but he is more accomplished writers. So yeah.
There's also that question of like the outcomes inside, because we were going around with like the outcomes in psychology and like how well that like can represent outcomes that might be wanted in other departments. And I was saying, like, yeah, it's the same. Like, you always want to synthesize a lit review, and you always want a citation style. But I think people have different ideas about, like, what the writing would look like and how comparable.
Yes.
I think that just, again, has, this is much bigger than this question, but I think this is a really great argument for your portfolio use, because you can really start to define what kinds of curriculum gets included in the portfolio, and you could try to start making some of those connections between how does demonstrating critical thinking in this space look different from demonstrating it here, right? So it could be really across the time that a student is in a program or across programs, right? And I think that's, where we all want to go, right? Is to help students understand that, but also it helps us to better understand what they understand about the programs, which I think oftentimes does not get enough attention, right? Like for them to be able to say, this is how I compose a high quality review of relevant psychology literature, right? And then have some artifacts in there to demonstrate that would be the ideal way to show that there is, that is benefiting them, right?
And I think that gets to one of the questions that we had to do with data collection. What sorts of information and data do you need to collect in order to make the case that the provost is asking you to address in this particular RAD study? Because it seems to me that if you were trying to do that, even on a relatively small scale, it would be really important to be able to collect artifacts from student writing at each of those different levels. Even if that meant sort of sitting down and finding a way to assess them, identifying criteria, in order to demonstrate this kind of writing development over time. If you're not looking at the actual writing itself, it's hard to be able to make any kind of assessment or judgment about the ways in which students are developing in their writing over time and in those courses. So if it were me constructing this RAD study and trying at least in some version to attempt to answer the provost question, one of the first things I would do is to say, okay, how can I collect artifacts in a way that's going to be manageable, that's going to be representative of the students who are taking those courses, that are going to reflect the criteria for assessment that we want to be able to not impose, but use to assess. Okay, and the reason why I say that is because we want to make sure that the genres of writing that you're collecting from students in each of these courses are comparable. That, according to whatever sort of assessment criteria you're going to be using. Okay, rather than collecting like an informal piece of writing in the first year compared to a capstone project that students are writing at the end. Those are likely to be such different genres and have such different features, it'll be hard to identify any kind of development or progress in student writing ability over time.
Somebody's done, sorry.
Oh.
I was just hearing the big thing.
Other thoughts?
So your freshmen don't write it forward.
Well, they make an early attempt.
So just to step back for a moment, I'm curious to hear you all maybe reflect for a moment on what does this get you thinking about the complications of designing RAD studies?
You're always like balancing like the time you have, the resources you have, and what you're trying to accomplish and how political that is or not, or like, because it seems like to me, my view of this is that if you don't participate in this, you're passing up an opportunity to do something that would be beneficial, but you don't want to get like railroaded or hamstrung, into something that would like be harmful. So I love that idea of like using it as a catapult to like e-portfolios or like some other entryway, because you're using something that somebody's super excited about to think about something that you think might be beneficial. Yeah. So, but that's very instrumental. So I guess like pure research versus like instrumental and practical stuff.
To what extent are those opposed? And
Yeah.
to what extent can they work in tandem with each
Right.
other? Yeah.
Well, your scenario kind of, well, from our conversation as well, it lends itself to thinking of it almost like a mini research proposal. When you put together a research grant proposal, we have a long study design in mind. And now we have to do something considerably less resource intensive and in probably in a shorter period of time. But we do know, I'm guessing we do know, that we will be in a similar situation next year when this course runs again, or the next sort of round of capstones, etc. So we can set up a sequence of studies to more than one research question, but we end up doing it over cycles of courses rather than one huge study. Yes.
One of the things I'm reflecting on listening to everybody is about how it takes a village. That none of the studies we talked about could be done by one person on one course release, at least unless somebody has 47 hours in the day and didn't tell us. Because you need the allies in that department to be able to help out with gathering those artifacts. And that depends upon a lot of relationships that you have built or your team has built over time. So I'm just thinking about how all of these you need RAD research, you need people.
And if I could piggyback on that, because that's what I was thinking too, this could be a great opportunity, not only to work with the provost on this study, but to pull in those partners from that department, so there becomes kind of sharing the work that we do with the professional learning opportunities, as well as in some of this assessment work. And so how could that design actually involve some of the faculty? Because what a great opportunity together to sit down and look at the writing and to tease out some of the assessment summaries they've given for 3 years. So it doesn't become like we're studying you, but instead we're together in this sort of partnership. Yeah.
Yeah, and luckily, at least in psychology, they ought to be kind of well versed in this kind of study. Right.
And then the leaders video study, if it is hopefully replicated with another department. Friends in engineering the next year.
For me, it just emphasizes how, and speaking as a faculty member, how research and inquiry gets tangled up with competition for resources. And, you know, there are questions that I could not, really ask. My colleague wouldn't want me to ask them, and they wouldn't want me to find out the answers, because, we've got things worked out in a way that works for my department, and, that's maybe more important than.
And I think that one of the keystones here has to do with getting collaborative partnerships working together, especially with faculty. Now, in the Department of Psychology, as it's described here, they already have something that looks like a vertical writing curriculum. And they wouldn't have put that in place if they didn't think that there were justifiable reasons for doing so, and were probably dedicated to their success. So it might be interesting as an initial study, as a pilot study, to collaborate with the faculty who teach those courses and get them to talk about, how do you see student writing improving in this course? What are the strengths and the weaknesses that students have? Or maybe even students to say, what did you learn about writing in your previous course, and how is that working for you in this class? So it's collecting data from students and from faculty. It's something that I think, except for the human, subject training, which will take a certain amount of time, could be accomplished relatively quickly and relatively easily, so that you could get data that would demonstrate that it, at least on the surface, appears to be having a demonstrable effect in certain ways on student writing. And maybe that becomes a springboard to a more nuanced and more sophisticated kind of study that develops it with different sorts of data.
Yeah, that's essentially, that's kind of what we thought was doable in the time frame with the parameters. Like, we probably don't have time to do like a longitudinal study of students' performance, but we could probably suss out some faculty and student perceptions of the impact that the program is having.
So, I really get caught up on the detail of the assessment, or assessing writing, and it's a balance. To me, it's very much like an art. There's also like science, like it's even like teaching is an art and a science, and trying to figure out how, like, what is good writing, and like how do we know when we see it, and so that's what I get really caught up in my head about, is in viewing results, like how do we know if goals have been met or objectives have been met, and are we just looking for clarity, like are we looking for varied sentence structure, like what are, like I get really caught up in those details. But that's
So do old people too.
okay.
These are persistent questions.
Yeah, that was a equal question, but
Yeah, but I do think that's one benefit of, developing a study in partnership with the faculty, because they're the ones who are embedded in the discipline and embedded in the context, and they're going to be thinking about the answer to those questions from a particular disciplinary and even department cultural perspective that maybe is different from the way that we might think of it as well. And so I think that kind of local context is really important for answering those questions. And if one local context answers it in a positive way, we can infer that another local context might as well, but it may not be a one-to-one correspondence when we get to engineering or business or whatever that other field might be.
But I think also your point goes to something other than assessment, it goes to more and trading back. So that's another.
Yeah.
And I don't want to monopolize here, but to me, that evidence seems totally inadequate to the work that was asked to be done. And one of the things that I would really love to see is the development of an expansive archive of teaching materials in the various disciplines. I mean, I've got some interest in looking back. There's a moment about a little more than a decade ago when the word reflection came into our vocabulary, and I've sort of watched it spread through my department. I like to be able to trace that, but those, people's teaching materials, maybe they're in the archives on their individual computers, but I wish I had access to some of those. And likewise, I think assessment data, let's look at the materials people looked at, the way they scored them, and think about those in relationship to what we're doing now. Because students change over time, and I think we need better archives.
Yeah, I mean, you get me thinking another potential archival study that could grow out of this question is in those 3 years that they've been doing departmental assessment, have those outcomes started becoming more present and prevalent in the syllabi and assignment sheets. Our faculty, in other words, taking up that vocabulary, that department level way of speaking and thinking about writing in the documents that they're presenting to students as well. That could be another signal of what it looks like to develop a departmental culture of writing.
So I got very caught, and I apologize to my group mates if I got too caught on this. On the fact that the provost has told you to come up with a positive outcome. And that the provost has told you that if you come up with a positive outcome, you could potentially get to develop a vertical WAC curriculum across your campus, which is something obviously we all would want to be able to do. I'm seeing a conflict because if I said, I'm going to design a study that shows how well this thing works, y'all would look back at me and say, well, that's not good research, right? So I got, again, my apologies if I got too stuck on this. I got really, really stuck on, I have been told to prove a positive where I don't know that there is one. So is that an intentional part of this scenario, or are we meant to just sit here and have our heads explode?
Yeah, like, I mean, I think many of us have been in that position of having an administrator come up with a bright idea and say, do this thing, we can do this, right? And so, yes, I mean, I think that definitely was part of it, is to get you thinking about, okay, how do we to develop something that meets kind of our ethical and methodological standards, to use that word, while also still addressing the kind of politics of that situation. Yeah, I think. And again, kind of going back to the fact that this person is a psychologist, ideally they then would be receptive to you saying, okay, here's the guardrails we would need to put on this kind of thing. In order
that's where I got stuck
to make it legitimate. Yeah.
Would a person who actually understands research even put it this way? But so I started building a provost in my head.
Yeah.
Did not have very good research methods, and I got a little stuck with my imaginary provost.
I have a couple technical questions.
Yeah.
Are we gonna have, it's not related to this, so should I hold them? Are we gonna have another sort of general question?
No, now would be a good time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And really they're technical questions, but you mentioned disease.
Michael mentioned it,
Yeah, I'm
yes.
very sorry. You guys are both great. See, we just.
And we both have beards. so-
Yeah.
And you switched where you're standing.
Yeah, right. Mess it all up.
Like students.
So one more question about that, you said that it codes text for you. Is that really?
No, you have to code the text.
Okay, so what does it actually?
What it allows you to do is to work with transcripts that are entered into the document, and then you can create your own coding schemes, very elaborate. And you can code the text using those schemes in that tool.
So you actually still do.
You still do have to, you still have to do the coding, yeah.
So does it then analyze it for you?
Well, what it does is it provides an analysis of the codes that you put in the text. So it can take a look at. them in terms of- It visualizes the code so that you can look at them in terms of frequency, where they appear,
Okay,
what
so
form they
it does
take.
show you, that does sound like a.
It does some of the analysis for you.
Interesting, that leads to my other question, which is that, do you have a good, what do you recommend for good statistical software, for t-value, standard deviation, and all those things? And I say that because I switched institutions, my previous institution, I always had an amazing statistician that did all that for me, and now I don't. So what do you for people who don't have this amazing thing over here? How do
I
you-
cannot answer that question.
I don't use deduce, I use PDA minor, which is a qualitative data analysis software that does similar things to deduce. And it actually has a stats optional add-on. QDA, it stands for qualitative data analysis minor, it's by Provalis. And then there is a word stat add-on, which does all the Greek stuff. The tails and tau's and t's and lambdas and. I mean, I still needed help even with the add-on, knowing what to ask the add-on to do, but it was there integrated with the coding software. So
It's also hugely expensive, but if your new institution is willing to pay, have at it.
Same with in vivo and SPSS, which would be kind of the other
Well,
ones
and
too.
Deduce has a limited time subscription offer, basically. So you can get it for a predetermined set of time and then the cost goes down.
And somebody wrote the subscription to do is at least 20 months if you're going to buy an ebook. So you can work with Deduce for about 20 months rather than buying an ebook.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And Vivo, another one of these. Yeah, it's quite expensive.
I'll also just say, I think I heard you all talking about earlier on, like iterator reliability calculations and that sort of thing. And the book, Coding Streams of Language, who are the authors? I'm blanking on the author's name.
Cheryl Geisler.
Geisler and Schwartz, yeah. It has the formulas for calculating iterator reliability in the book, and it's not difficult to recreate that in Excel as well. So I've done that work too, so it doesn't require any complicated statistical package to do that.
Chris, do you want to move us on to the last part of the session? I think we're getting close to the end.
Yeah, so the last thing is the opportunity for you all to kind of think back to your own research, maybe that you have either you're working on projects right now, or perhaps you're doing a new study or a follow-up study that's what you've been doing, and just to do a little bit of reflection. So it's back here, it's a reflection worksheet. You'll need to either like download it or copy it over to your own Google Drive so that we're not all just like writing it at the same time. But you can see there's opportunity to find a research question, putting in some things about like research in the literature, where you go, questions about study design, data collection, methods of analysis, etc. We don't expect that you're going to necessarily finish this in the next 9 minutes, but you might want to just pause for a moment, look over it, think about how might you start to fill this out, and you can take it with you as a planning document as well.
You can just call yourself the provost and insist that they help.
You had 9 minutes to plan an entire, I mean, we give you 20 minutes to plan an entire study as it was, right? Also, I just wanted to make a quick self-promotion-y kind of plug. I'm one of the co-editors for the edited collection that will come out of the conference. We're calling it Writing Worldviews. Magnus is one of the co-editors as well. And so if this gets you thinking about what you're presenting while you're here, the contributions don't have to use a RAD approach, I should say that, but we do expect them to be empirical or empirically informed theoretical work, that sort of thing too. So I hope you'll consider contributing. I have copies of the CFP here, so if you want one, you can just raise your hand, and we hope you'll contribute as well.
I know, I've written this down for a while.
I'll put the stacks up here too. Yeah, sure. You're welcome. Welcome.
Yeah. Not mention it.
You know, like, it's like, hey, don't do this. Like, I don't have to do this to you.
So that. Yeah. So that.
Yeah, like, in some things. Yeah, I mean. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you doing anything at 3:30 or? I can chill. Yeah, that's what I'm gonna do too. My wife. Makes sense.
You're like, really talk.
It's been good though. It's been nice to be back in this space again. Seeing everybody.
I imagine there are a lot of people that are.
Yeah, probably. It doesn't seem, I didn't get the sense that it was like jam packed out there by any means.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was envisioning. It was just cars fighting for space. Yeah.
No, not yet. There's only 250 attendees, I think.
I was thinking about.
Yeah. We'll probably get the final numbers at some point. No, I'll just go ahead and say thanks to everybody. So we're not going to keep anybody hostage, right? So just wanted to say thank you all for being here, for your participation, and we hope that you got something out of it. And yeah, that's really the important thing, right? And of course, we're always here, like, we're happy to answer questions or chat or email or anything like that if you ever want to think about something too. So thank you. Have a good conference.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for your help.